You, Jenna.
Okie dokie. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining tonight. I know it's a crazy time of year, and so I'm appreciative that you've gotten your way to hear what I have to say this evening. You're here for a high school transitions webinar. As Karen said, I'm going to acknowledge some of the changes that your children are experiencing, but then we're going to move into the strategies, and those will apply across all ages within high school. But I think it's important to just acknowledge that your children are as nervous for this switch as you are. I actually ran into a neighbor of mine the other day who's starting as a freshman and asked him, like, are you excited? He was like, oh my gosh, I'm so nervous. I'm a little worried I'm going to get lost. Don't know any of the teachers, right? So that's how everybody's feeling. And it's important to just know that and try to not have your nervousness influence or multiply theirs, right? They're going from being the big fish in their middle school rather to the small fish. There's way more expectations in high school. There's a feeling of, well, they should know how to study. They should know how to take notes. As my neighbor pointed out, it's often a new building. Kids are super aware that at this point, once they move into high school, they're now like prepping for college. It counts in a way that it didn't before. And for a lot of kids, that can have a weight to it. And then there's just generally more responsibility, right? There's going to be a little bit less scaffolding, hopefully still some, but not quite the extent there was in middle school. Parents, I know somebody wrote in a question about how can you help? Really, it's your job to teach them to advocate for themselves and to move them over the next 4 years into being independent, right? Because this phase ends in college and you're not going with them, right? So you want to ask them a lot of questions, prompt them to think about things by the questions you ask, rather than by pointing out to them the ways they're messing up or the things that they're not thinking about, right? Keep in mind, their brains are still developing, and so it is expected that you will need to guide them. That's not to say there's never a space for you to step in, but you really want to try to sort of coach them into doing things for themselves as much as possible. I also want to just kind of highlight here that the biggest change for a lot of high schoolers is the importance that long-term planning starts to take. And that's everything from course selection in terms of, do I try to get into the honors math track, or do I start my language? Do I stick with the language maybe that I started in middle school? Do I shift to a new one? What impact will that have on the options I have as I progress through high school, on the way that I'm putting together my college application? Projects are going to start to be a little bit longer, a little bit bigger. I know when I taught high school history, we did a historical thesis that kids spent an entire year on, and we asked them to start thinking about their topics as early as October, right? Cumulative exams start to take prominence in a way that they didn't in middle school. Most of the students I'm working with in high school have a cumulative midterm and or a cumulative final in at least one class. And then extracurricular activities start to also really fill up the calendar in a way that requires more planning than it maybe did in the past, right? They also have opportunities to try lots of new things. There's clubs that there weren't when they were in middle school. There start to be in lots of schools more opportunities to be parts of, theater programs or the marching band, right? And all kinds of things that didn't exist in middle school. And so that just puts a larger pull on their time. And again, asks more of them as far as planning goes. So as you can imagine, we'll spend a good bit of time on that over the next half an hour. So as far as self-advocacy goes, again, this is something that we're always trying to teach our students when we're doing executive functioning coaching. Lots of teachers are going to have sort of very specific supply lists in terms of, I want a 1-inch binder and a matching colored folder, or I want this color pen. And in my experience, that is always a teacher that's trying to give their students the support of a strong organizational system. And if your child knows that something else works well for them, you want to encourage them to ask if they can use the system that they know works well for them. This again is really laying the groundwork for a strong academic career, both through high school, where they might eventually want to start asking for allowances to explore different topics on a research paper, right? Or to present things in a slightly different way. And in through college, where if anyone has right now an IEP or a 504, they're going to really need to self-advocate in order to have those same kinds of accommodations once they get into college. So the self-advocacy is incredibly important. I also like to highlight note-taking and tests as opportunities for self-advocacy, in that if students are taking notes, and hopefully they are, it can be really great to encourage them to bring those notes to their teachers on occasion and just sort of say like, hey, I've been taking notes on what I think are the top 3 ideas every class period. Can you look at them, make sure I'm on the right track? Do you agree that these are the standout ideas, right? Or, hey, you gave us a really great study guide, teacher. I also went ahead and drafted some questions that I thought would be appropriate test questions. Do you feel like I'm on the right track here? This is going to develop stronger relationships with teachers, and that's important in high school because they have so many. The teachers have, upwards of 100 kids that they're seeing in a day. And those kinds of conversations are going to allow them to get to know your child in a way that allows them to teach them more effectively, and makes it pretty likely that they're going to sort of, if this is a do I give a partial credit on this question or not situation, if it's a kid is really invested, the answer is usually yes, I do. And then just overall, right, they can be emailing their teachers if they have questions, and things of that nature, right? And so you as parents can really encourage them to do that and ask them about ways that they're working to form those relationships. Cool, see, I told you I was going to talk fast. All right, next, we've got here elements of a planning system. I really do not believe that there is a best planning system. I have my favorite planner for me, but I don't necessarily say to every kid, you need to have this planner. And that's because I recognize that planning is an intimately individualized, personalized thing. And I think it's important that you empower your children to discover what system's going to work well for them and how they plan. And that means it's okay if it's not the same way that you plan. And so I'm going to talk about elements of a system rather than this is how anyone should do it. So I think number one here, as we're going through this, is that we always want to be thinking about small chunks of doing things, right? Things that are manageable tasks that we can do in one sitting. And we want to be explicit about what those tasks actually are, right? So for instance, if there is a test coming up next Friday, you don't want to put on your planner just test next Friday, because that is not actionable and I cannot prepare for it in one sitting, right? So I can't sit down, make progress, and cross that off. Rather, I want to go ahead and chunk that out. I want to put on one day, identify key terms for my test. I want to put on another day, define my key terms or write questions about my key terms, right? What's different from that than writing just test is, one, they are actions, right? It is clear what exactly I need to do. And two, like I said, I can sit down, I can do it in one setting, I can check it off. And by checking it off, I'm going to feel accomplished, right? So if that's sort of overlain on top of everything else I'm going to say, important to take note. We need a monthly view. That's the place where we're going to take note of any time-bound, not regular activities, right? So if we go back to those extracurriculars, if you're on the tennis team, you don't need to put in practice every day because it's every day and you're probably going to remember to show up. But if there's a match at a school that happens to be far away, that really better be on your monthly view, right? In fact, any match should be on your monthly view because you might be getting home later than usual. If you've got a performance, that goes there. If you've got a doctor's appointment, if you've got a birthday party or a social engagement, kids don't call them social engagements, but if you've got one, it should go there, right? Because we need to plan around it in order to be able to go. That's also where we're going to have those major due dates, things like the tests and the projects and the essays. And I just had all of my students this week go through their entire calendar and put all their days off and all of the ends of the quarter. We know when the end of the quarter is approaching probably there's going to be a lot of things due and a lot of tests we need to prepare for. So having that on our monthly view and not getting caught off guard is empowering ultimately, right? And is going to lead us to being more successful. You need a daily plan that is written down, right? It's okay if that's in a separate place from your monthly view. In fact, probably it should be, because the monthly view is really just that. It's a bird's eye view, and we don't want it to get cluttered with all the little things you need to do today. You know, don't forget to bring the permission slip back signed. Doesn't need to go on your monthly view, but it does need to go on your daily plan. And so I tell kids to think of their daily plan as a to-do list. What are all of the things that you need to get done today? And it does need to be in one spot, right? It's not that you can have, well, I've got one thing on my monthly view that I know I need to do. I've got the other thing that I'm remembering that my mom asked of me today, and everything else is on Canvas or Google Classroom or Schoology, right? And I'll just sort of click through that as I go. We'll talk about, I'll talk about it now just in case, working memory, right? The problem with having all those things in different places is that it's a huge tax on our working memory. Our working memory is the memory we use to manipulate information as we're using it. And for all of us, we have a finite amount that we really don't have a lot of control over trying to grow, right? It sort of just is what it is. And so if we're holding all those pieces in our head, then we have less working memory available to do the things we're trying to do. It's going to take us longer to do our math homework. We're less likely to keep track of what we need to, and we're much more likely to forget things. The other thing I like to point out to kids is if you're using Canvas, Schoology, Google Classroom as your homework book, fine, but you need to write it down the day that you're going to do it, because otherwise kids spend loads of time sort of clicking through everything once to get an idea of how much homework they have. They get to the end, they don't remember what page they need to answer the science questions on. They have to go find that again. By the time they do that, they don't remember where they found the English worksheet. And so it's just a lot of wasted time. Whereas if you write it down, it's done, right? It's really easy to look at that sheet of paper you've got in front of you, or the Post-it you put on your desktop if you prefer. And then you also need something that's going to lead to weekly reflection, right? In terms of when I look back over the past week, what things worked well for me? Is it the way I studied for a particular test? Is it the time I gave myself between different tasks? Whatever it might be, you want to take note of that so that you can repeat it again. And likewise, what didn't go so well, and take some time to think about how can I adjust that, right? And so that's incredibly important. Lots of kids will do monthly view and daily plan, kind of, right? But very few will build in that weekly reflection. And again, parents, that's a place where if they're not going to set the time aside themselves, you can sort of just make it happen by being interested in how their week went and prompting them to notice what's going well for them and what do they see as challenges coming up. Some of my favorite planning tools or things to just take note of. Whiteboards are fantastic. I really like them for anything. Kids are less resistant to them than planners often. They make some that are monthly views, right? And it's really easy to just sort of write things on there, erase it, start over. I also have some kids that'll use just a plain whiteboard and they'll jot down their daily to-dos there. Planners are great. One of the things we're going to send you after this webinar is the executive functioning team at Private Prep's list of planning tips and our favorite tools. Our favorite planners are there. So you'll see what those are when I email you later, later tomorrow, to be clear. Small notebooks are also really great. These are the Moleskine ones that probably you've all seen. Again, you can kind of sneak kids into planning without giving them a planner if they're resistant. Lots of the kids I work with like these notebooks. They're very small. They fit easily into a pocket. They're a winner. To-do lists are fantastic. Like I said, that daily view doesn't need to be tied to a specific calendar date. If you want a digital option for that, my favorite app is Todoist. It's free. It syncs across everything that anyone ever owned. You can color code things. You can have subtasks within one task. And kids like it because you can also type like, do this by next Friday, and it recognizes that next Friday and it'll plug in a date. It also syncs with Google Calendar, which is super cool. And for high school students, I like to start highlighting the importance of syllabi in planning. They're not quite like college syllabi where you can see week by week exactly what you're going to do, but you can get a really good idea of what's important to your teacher. I just, again, did this activity with a student of mine this past week. It's the beginning of school. This is what's going on. And we noticed that in every single one of her classes this year, tests and quizzes make up at least 50% of her grade. And that's important for us to take note of, because this is a student who tends to get over-invested in nightly homeworks. And in some cases, they're only 10% of her grade. And we know now when we plan that we need to be spending a lot more of her time on long-term retention strategies and cyclical studying so that she can excel on those cumulative tests that come throughout the year. All right. Also, if we're going to plan, we need to be able to prioritize, right? It's not enough to just sort of list everything we need to do and get overwhelmed and start doing whatever happens to be at the top of the list. So a couple strategies or time-proven methods for doing that. The Eisenhower matrix is exactly what it sounds like. It's a matrix, right? It's just 4 quadrants like this. How's that for a visual? Across the top, you've got not urgent, urgent, and down the left, you've got not important, important, and you sort of sort your tasks into those 4 boxes. So something might be urgent, due tomorrow, but not important, right? Like if homework's only 10%, again, I'm not advocating not doing homework. I'm just saying we need to be able to sort based on the reality of our lives, right? Something might be urgent, text my friend back, not important because she'll still talk to me tomorrow no matter what. Or they might be not urgent, but important. Essay due next Friday. That's going to be a big chunk of my quarter grade and is going to take me a lot of time. And so as we start to see where those things sort, that's going to tell us where we should be spending our time first, right? If they're not important and also not urgent, we probably should skip them. Some students prefer something that's just a 1, 2, 3. They kind of do a gut check and rank them on any given day. Works for me. The point is that they're being deliberate, they're thinking about it, and they're deciding, as opposed to just flying by the seat of their pants and doing things in whatever order. It's also important to just kind of, for some kids, be aware of time constraints and how that's going to impact which task we pick up. For students who are super, super busy, knowing that right now I have 15 minutes and this is the task that I can get done in 15 minutes is going to make that particular task a priority for the given moment, right? And then some students also like to consider difficulty in terms of how they prioritize. There are students that like to start with the most difficult task, get that done, and so they feel like they're kind of coasting then through the rest of their homework. There are kids that have difficulty getting started, and they're going to want to start with an easier task and kind of, once they're in the thinking mode, once they're in homework mode, they'll get to the more difficult things. And then I've got some students that actually like to alternate difficult tasks, really use a lot of my brain power, easier task, sort of productive break. And again, there's not a best way to do this. It's just a matter of your child should begin starting to identify what works for them. And also, again, as far as your role, you can sort of ask them about which ways they prefer to do this. If there's a day where they feel really stressed and there's a lot on their plate, ask them, how are you thinking about deciding what to do first? Have you ever seen this method? Which one, if you had to sort them 1 to 3, which ones would you make a 1? Which ones would you make a 3, right? And just help them sort of figure that out on their own. Another really important way to begin prioritizing is to actually think about the amount of time that we have in a week. This exercise I'm about to describe is one of my very favorites to do with just about anyone, adults included, as Karen suggested at the top of this. And what we've got here is a chart. Down the left, we sort of make a list of all the activities that are needing to fit in someone's life, right? So homework, obviously, going to school, traveling to school, self-care, because probably we're showering and brushing our teeth with some regularity, sleep, meals with the family, whatever sport practice, whatever club, right? You really want to think about what all of these things are. reading for pleasure, spending time with friends, screen time. I know parents, we all try to limit it, but it's happening anyway, so we need to name that. And then in that middle column there, I ask students to think about how they want their life to look, right? And write down the number of hours each week that they're spending on each of those activities. We then add them up and see where we land. If we are perfectly balanced, we're going to have 168 hours accounted for in our week. As you can imagine, rarely is that how it goes. Some students are going to have way more than 168, at which point we really need to think about what are our priorities? Where can I pull back some of those hours? Am I expecting too much of myself? Right? Some students, on the other hand, I've had students tell me, you know what, there's no way I could do more than a half an hour of homework a night. We do this time audit, and it turns out there's 20 hours a week unaccounted for. And to me, like, hey, great. We could do all the homework that possibly would come up. And I think, again, it's just important to notice that if students feel busy and they can't account for all of the time, it's worth them then kind of paying a little bit more attention to where the time goes. Are they accidentally spending more time than they meant to on Snapchat or Facebook or TikTok or whatever the people are doing? And if you have a kid that really has no idea where their time is going, Toggle, no E on that on purpose. It's not a typo, that was hard to say, is a really great app to just sort of track where time's going and get an idea. Because again, at 9th grade, right, or at any point in high school, kids' brains are really just still developing. In fact, the second growth spurt in our brains tends to start on average around the age of 12. If it's a student who has ADHD or any other processing issues, we're going to bump that back by about 2 years. And so they don't know how to track their time yet. And you can really kind of ask them, hey, how long do you think that's going to take? Was your estimate actually on target with what you ended up doing? To help them develop that awareness of time. And that's really a first step in being able to plan, right? Because if we don't know how long something's going to take, there's really sort of no chance that we're going to have an effective plan to complete it. So couple time management tips here. Obviously, time management could be a fully separate webinar. It's not today, though, so I talk quickly again. Breaks are important. They lead to greater productivity. So lots of kids will tend to want to do I'm going to sit down and bang through everything. And in high school, that might be 2 to 4 hours of work. And the problem is that their attention span is not 2 to 4 hours long. And so at some point, they're getting really diminishing returns. By the way, that some point is probably 15 to 25 minutes in. And so I really like to work with kids to think about, am I going to work 25 minutes and then take a timed 10-minute break? Am I going to complete an assignment and then do a little bit of stretching? But that's a conversation that needs to happen about where breaks are fitting in. I already talked about estimating time, super important. Again, I have lots of students who sit down and end up spending all night on their homework. They're a little bit unfocused. They feel a little bit overwhelmed. Just adding a step, again, let's assume they're taking my advice and writing a daily to-do list, going through and guessing how long each of those tasks are going to take will really give your child an idea of how focused do they need to be on a given day in order to get things done. Also, as I said, it's going to increase their awareness of time. If they don't have a strong awareness of time, we want to create any system we can that allows them to visualize that time. It might be a sand timer, like the one in my lovely visual. The time timer is a super popular one. You could Google it right now. You'll see it's super visual. Also, it could be one of my favorite planners on the resource that I'll send you tomorrow is made by Order Out of Chaos, and it's got a band along the bottom where kids can actually plug in their time-bound activities and then plug in their tasks around that to see where things need to fit within the time. And I said use timers. Use timers. They're so helpful. I use timers. They are motivating. You know, if I've got a big task ahead of me, I'll say, you know what, I'm just going to do 15 minutes and see how I'm doing. I'll set that timer. It makes it very approachable for me. And also I can see how it's going, timers for breaks so that they don't accidentally get too long. There's 1,000 reasons to do that. All right, study habits. I know somebody asked about long-term retention. And so I think what's important to recognize is that our brains are actually made for forgetting, not for remembering. And that sounds crazy, but you'll realize it's true when you think about, like, you ate breakfast every day for the past week, and your brain really doesn't need to keep track of what that was, right? So there are way more experiences in the day that we don't need to track than there are experiences that we need to remember. And so we must be deliberate if we have the intention of retaining anything that we're experiencing. And the way we do that is to create and strengthen multiple pathways to information. We do that by accessing the information multiple times, right? And ideally doing it in slightly different ways each time. We can also do that by mapping new information onto old neural pathways, right? So kind of thinking, how is this like something I learned previously? What does this remind me of? What is the opposite of? Those are all great general approaches, right? This chart I've got lays out kind of the ideal pacing for those multiple exposures I was talking about. And it breaks down so that you should get information, review it immediately after you get it. That is hard in the context of the school day, but kids absolutely could, for a particularly difficult class, review their notes from that day, the day they get home, review it again the next day, 24 hours later, a week later, and then kind of the intervals start to matter a little bit less after that, right? So again, it's right after, 24 hours later, a week later. And if we've kind of got that built in, we're going to find that when it's time to study for the test, we've actually retained the vast majority of the information just by virtue of the habits that we're building. And kind of got these last two notes. The more active we are as we're doing that, right? And by active, I mean actually doing something with the information. When I ask students how they plan to study, lots of times they'll say, I'm going to review my notes. And that means passively read my notes aimlessly. Not good enough. I'm going to review my notes and underline every single keyword. I'm going to review my notes and color code them for historical themes, right? Now we're being more active. There's a lot more active things we can do. We'll touch on them later. But that's what I mean. And prove it. When it's time for the test, lots of kids will say, I'm ready. And I'll ask, how do you know? I just know. They've not proved it. They need to complete the teacher's study guide without their notes. They need to cover up their answers on their vocabulary and be able to actually say them in coherent sentences, whatever it is they need to prove. All right, deep breath there. Organizing information. Again, in middle school, there was probably a lot of instruction about how to take notes. In high school, they now need to do it on their own. My favorite method here is Cornell notes. That's the visual you've got, because it really lends itself to those multiple exposures that I was talking about. So I ask kids to fill out that right column during class. This is where they're taking notes based on what the teacher says, right? That should obviously have a heading. It should have the date. If they don't feel like they know the heading based on the start of the class, they can go ahead and plug that heading in at the end of the class. Then when they get home, I ask the kids to fill out that left column, which is called the Q column. This is where we're going to write main ideas or write questions that we think we need to be able to answer eventually when there's an exam. And doing that, we're active with the information, right? We're really starting to synthesize it and think about what's the most important. That counts as a second exposure. And then at the end of the week, I ask them to fill out this bottom section, which is the summary section. What are the key takeaways here? What do I need to know? 1 or 2 sentences that sums up the page. That counts as another exposure, right? And then I'm well on my way to retaining that information. Beautiful. I'll also just throw in top 3. If Cornell Notes is overwhelming, write down what you think are the top 3 ideas from a class. And as I said earlier, check them with the teacher at some point. All right. That's organizing information. In terms of creating a study plan, right? A couple things that we need to know here. 1, any study plan for any test includes 4 or more study sessions, right? That is because of everything I just said about what it looks like to really retain information. It is a bummer to study well enough to pass the test, but not well enough to retain it for the final. And so if a kid wants to study 2 hours, don't do it the night of the test, break it up and do half an hour 4 times, right? I'm not asking for more time, I'm asking for wiser time. We talked about mixing up your approach. We talked about having clear goals. Study sessions don't need to be just sit there for half an hour and study. I want to know, what are you trying to do, right? Really plan that out. Again, this is part of also the chunking we talked about for planning. As soon as I know I've got a test on a particular date, I should sit down and make my study plan, put that into my planner, however it fits. And as I said earlier, always, 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 I ask my students to make a tool that they plan to share with the teacher for feedback. We've got here some different study methods. If you don't know how to mix it up, I'm not going to talk you through every single one of these. Feel free to follow up and ask a question if you've got them, but I'll highlight a couple that are less usual. I talked about study guides and phases, right? This is where we're going to ask for multiple copies of a study guide when a teacher gives it. The first time we might go through and really fill it out super meticulously with our notes. The second time we might see, hey, do I really remember everything? I'm going to try to fill it out without my notes. I'm doing that on a separate day, by the way. I might even cut it up and try to do the study guide out of order the second time, right? So that's phases. I think illustrating ideas is really underused as a great study guide. I actually like this for history. If there's a particular historical figure and I've got an artistic student, I like to ask them to draw a portrait of that figure and include details and accessories and think about why they're including those, what's going on in history, what do we know about that historical figure that led to those decisions. That's going to be retained pretty well. I also really like the idea of having students make voice recordings of things they need to memorize. It's easy then, if that's on their phone, to just pop in headphones and listen to it while they walk to the subway or while they walk to the bus or while you drive them to school or whatever it is. Okay, beautiful. I am almost on time. That's a lot of information I threw at you. I think both for you to know and for your children to know. It's not all going to happen right away, right? This is a long journey, and it's super important to celebrate successes along the way, right? That both lets your child know that you're noticing when they do well. It's going to reinforce and make it more likely that they will preach that, and it will help you limit your frustration at the moments where they're not doing exactly what you would hope, because you're raising your awareness of the things that they're succeeding in and the things that you're pleased about. This is my contact information. As I said, if you've got any questions, definitely follow up via email, but also feel free to throw them in the chat or the Q&A box now.
Thank you, Jenna. That was amazing, as always, filled with information. Actually, as I was watching this, I was like, I think I need to take some of your slides and send it to my son in college, because I think he could use some of this, how to break things down and how to read his notes, because I'm pretty sure he's not doing that.
Yeah, it's hard.
Okay, I think we do have a question here. Somebody wants to know how they can help their child manage their technology.
Yeah. Super hard. I think difficult because, as I alluded to with sort of all of the online learning centers, it's part of doing school. And so for you to impose limitations will almost definitely not work. Probably most of us have experienced that. And so my advice is to really have a conversation with your child about what distracts them from really focusing on their work when they're doing their work. In my experience, most kids are frustrated at the way their social time and their fun time bleeds into their work time, and it leads them to feeling like they're always working, and they're very interested in separating that. So if you ask them what's distracting them, they will very often say their phone, and now you've got an opportunity to problem solve together. What aspects of technology are distracting you? Is there anything you can do to sort of try and get that under control? Is there a place you want to put your phone while you're doing your work? I once had a kid, his idea, bought a lockbox for while he was doing his homework. If I or the parent had suggested that, pretty guaranteed it wouldn't have worked. One of my favorites in that category is app detox, and sorry, there's another one, pardon me while I look at my app block. Those are apps where kids or you, I use it, can make rules for specific apps, right? So a number of opens a day, a number of minutes a week, whatever the thing is, and that tends to let kids align their use with how they think they should be using it.
Great. We have another question. Any specific thoughts on how to study languages?
Yeah, I was actually a Spanish teacher for a long time. So many thoughts. So I think everything I said really applies with languages, right? Languages, we've got a lot of memorizing vocabulary. Something that I'll say specific to languages that doesn't apply everywhere else is the drawing is actually really great. Kids, again, tend to want to make a lot of flashcards to memorize vocabulary. We're much better off associating a foreign language word with the image or with our idea of the action than with the English word itself in terms of retention. Drawing is a drag. I know it doesn't have to be beautiful. So that works. But again, the multiple exposures are going to be incredibly important. So with any students I have right now that have foreign language or that struggle with the retention, I have them begin their study plan the day they get their vocabulary list. And I don't, contrary to what you might expect, get any resistance on that because they understand the idea of spreading out the time it takes over many days as feeling actually less cumbersome than trying real hard to cram it for the first test and again for the midterm and again for the final. And then as far as like grammar rules, that's going to get more complex and I feel like we might have to follow up offline.
Excellent. And another question. So my child's in 11th grade. What would you say my child needs to focus on?
Oh God. There's so many answers to that. So let's be clear. I am not a college admissions coach. And they can give a much more specific answer possibly than I can, depending what parts of my answer you want more information on. So I think one thing is they should focus on the things that they are passionate about, right? We hear over and over that kind of having really developed skills or really developed interests is more appealing than having a smattering all over the place. Again, that requires planning. I think obviously being strong academically is super important, right? We can't be perfect everywhere, but we want to do our best work all of the time. And then the other thing I'll say that may or may not be what you were looking for is to start to think about developing the habits and really getting to know yourself as a learner. One, that'll help you today with being a successful student, but two, students who know themselves as learners have a much easier time transitioning to college, right? So beginning to develop the study habits that we talked about earlier, those are going to be fundamental in college, right? Starting to have a monthly and a daily view, again, fundamental in college. So if parents are still managing calendars for juniors and seniors, I start to really suggest that you scale back. I start to talk to students about some kind of life skills, right? Like it's helpful to know how to do your laundry before you get to college, because otherwise somebody ends up with all the pink t-shirts, right? So some of that too can be empowering in terms of things that are very manageable ways to feel like you're ready to go off to school.
Great answer. I think that's all I'm seeing at the moment. Of course, again, feel free to reach out. You know how to get in touch with Jenna. And we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks you
again, everybody.
It was wonderful.
My pleasure. I'll send a follow-up to everybody tomorrow. Good night.
Have a good night.